I was holding a glass of champagne in one hand and my phone in the other when I saw his name light up the screen. Ryan. Not Ryan X, not Ryan, do not answer, the way I'd renamed him 8 months earlier at 2 in the morning, crying on my bathroom floor. Just Ryan. Like nothing had ever happened, like he hadn't spent the last year of our relationship sleeping with my best friend. My boss was 2 feet away from me, still shaking my hand, still saying the words I had worked 4 years to hear. Congratulations, Elena, VP of Marketing. You earned every bit of this. And Ryan was calling me on that exact day at that exact hour. I almost didn't answer. I want you to know that. I almost let it ring out, the way I had let every one of his calls ring out for the past 8 months. But something in me, some small, curious, still healing part of me, wanted to know why. Why now? Why today of all the days he could have picked? So I stepped into the hallway outside the conference room, my heels clicking against the marble floor, my heart doing something strange and fast in my chest, and I answered. Elena? His voice cracked like he'd been crying. I saw your promotion post on LinkedIn. I'm so proud of you. I need to see you. I made the biggest mistake of my life. I stood there in that hallway, still in my blazer, still smelling like the champagne I hadn't even gotten to drink yet, and I felt something click into place in my chest. Something cold, something clear. Because I knew something Ryan didn't know I knew. I knew exactly why he was calling me today. And by the end of this story, you're going to know it too. And you're going to understand why what I did next wasn't revenge. It was just the truth finally catching up to him. Hey, welcome back. Or if this is your first time here, welcome. I'm going to tell you the full story tonight. How the man who cheated on me with my best friend for over a year came crawling back the exact same day I got the biggest promotion of my career, what he didn't know I'd been quietly building behind the scenes for months, and how it all came crashing down on him in front of everyone who mattered to him. I need you to stick with me for this one, because I promise you this gets so much worse before it gets better. There's a twist about 2/3 of the way through this story that even I didn't see coming when it was happening to me in real time. And trust me, if you think you know where this is going, you don't. Before we get into it, if you're new here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because I guarantee by the end of this video, you're going to want to hear how this one really ends. Okay, let's go back to the beginning. My name is Elena. I'm 31 years old, and at the time all of this started, I was 26, working my first real marketing job at a mid-sized ad agency in Chicago, living in a tiny one-bedroom apartment with water stains on the ceiling that looked like a map of a country that didn't exist. I met Ryan at a friend's birthday party in the fall. He was funny in that easy, confident way, the kind of funny that makes a room lean toward him. He worked in finance, wore his shirts a little too well fitted, and had this habit of remembering small details about you after only one conversation. My coffee order, my sister's name, the fact that I was scared of birds, specifically pigeons, specifically the way they walk. I fell for him fast. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. For the first 2 years, Ryan was genuinely wonderful. He showed up. He remembered anniversaries. He drove 4 hours with me to see my grandmother in the hospital and held my hand the entire ride without saying a word, because he somehow knew that's exactly what I needed. There's a version of this story where I could tell you Ryan was a monster from day one, someone you could spot coming from a mile away if you just paid closer attention. I wish it were that simple, because then this would be a much easier lesson to learn. But the truth is, for a long time, Ryan made me a better version of myself. He was the first person who ever told me my ambition was attractive instead of intimidating. When I got nervous for a big client pitch in my second year at the agency, he stayed up with me until midnight running through talking points because he said watching me succeed felt like his favorite hobby. I believed him. I had no reason not to. Our first apartment together had this ugly, oversized armchair that Ryan insisted on keeping from his college days, this faded green thing that clashed with literally everything else we owned. I hated it, he loved it. We joked that whoever got custody of the ugly chair in a hypothetical future breakup would automatically win. I used to laugh every time he made that joke. I think about that chair sometimes now in my new apartment, which has exactly 0 ugly green armchairs in it. Funny how the things that feel like inside jokes at the beginning of a relationship can feel like early warning signs once you know how the story ends.
We moved in together after year 2. My friends were thrilled for me. My mom cried actual tears of joy when we told her. Even my dad, who has never once complimented a man I dated, told me Ryan was a keeper. I believed it completely. I built my whole future around that belief. But if I'm being honest with you now, and this whole video is me being honest with you, there were things, small things I explained away at the time because I didn't want to look directly at them. The first thing was his phone. Around year 3, he started sleeping with it face down on the nightstand. Before that, he never cared where his phone was. Then suddenly, it was always face down, always within reach, always with a passcode that changed every few months, for work security, he said. I didn't push it. I trusted him. That's what you do when you love someone. You give them the benefit of the doubt, because the alternative is unbearable. The second thing was Brianna. Brianna had been my best friend since college. We were the kind of close where we finished each other's sentences, where she was in my wedding party before I even had a wedding to plan, where she knew things about me that I hadn't even told my own sister. When Ryan and I started dating, Brianna and Ryan got close too, which felt natural. She was my best friend. Of course they'd become friends. Looking back now, I can pinpoint the exact month it shifted. It was subtle. Brianna started texting Ryan directly instead of going through me to make plans. She started showing up to things coincidentally whenever Ryan mentioned he'd be somewhere. She started asking me, casually, so casually, about our relationship problems, whether Ryan and I were happy, whether I ever got bored of him, whether I thought long-term relationships eventually lost their spark. I told her everything, every insecurity, every small fight Ryan and I had. I had no idea I was handing her a map. There was a night, I remember this one clearly because it's the one I go back to now and understand completely differently than I did at the time. It was my 28th birthday. Ryan planned a dinner for me at this small Italian place downtown, the kind with candles stuck in old wine bottles, and a waiter who calls everyone Bella. Brianna came too, because of course she did, she was my best friend. Halfway through dinner, Ryan excused himself to the bathroom. He was gone almost 15 minutes. When he came back, Brianna's face was flushed, and she immediately picked up her water glass and drank the whole thing. I asked if everything was okay. She said she was just hot. It was February in Chicago. I want to be really clear with you about something, because I think a lot of people watching this have lived some version of it. I wasn't stupid. I wasn't blind. I noticed things. But noticing something and letting yourself believe it are two completely different processes. And betrayal, real betrayal from people you trust completely, works specifically because it exploits that gap. It counts on you loving them too much to look directly at the evidence. That's exactly what Ryan and Brianna counted on, and for over a year, it worked. Around that same time, my career actually started taking off. I'd been promoted from coordinator to senior marketing associate, and my director, a woman named Patricia, who I still work with today, and who becomes very important later in this story, started giving me bigger accounts, bigger campaigns, more visibility with clients. I was staying late more,
traveling for pitches, building something I was genuinely proud of. Ryan started calling it my work-wife era, joking that the agency was seeing more of me than he was. At the time, I laughed it off. Looking back, I think it was the beginning of him building a narrative, one where my ambition became the excuse for what he was already doing behind my back. Here's the thing nobody tells you about cheaters. They rarely just cheat. They also build a case. Quietly, over months, they collect small grievances. You work too much, you're distracted, you've changed, so that when the truth eventually comes out, they already have their defense prepared. Ryan was doing exactly that, and I had absolutely no idea. There's one more moment from this period I need to tell you about, because it's the moment that, years later, would matter more than anything else. It was a Sunday morning. Ryan and Brianna and I were having brunch, the three of us, like always, and Brianna made an offhand joke. She said, "If you two ever break up, I call dibs on him." Everyone laughed. Ryan laughed the loudest. I laughed too, because what else do you do? But I remember, just for a second, the way Ryan's eyes flicked toward her before he laughed. Just a flicker, a half second of something I didn't have a name for yet. I have that half second memorized now. I've replayed it hundreds of times since. At the time, I told myself it was nothing. It was not nothing. By the time we reached the 4th year of our relationship, Ryan had started talking about marriage. Vaguely, in that way men do when they want credit for the intention without the commitment of the action. When we get married someday, our future kids, the house we'll eventually buy. I was so happy hearing those words that I never once stopped to ask why none of it ever turned into an actual conversation with a timeline. I know now that a man who is actively planning a future with someone else does not need to rush toward marriage with you. He needs you comfortable. He needs you patient. He needs you exactly where you were, hopeful, trusting, and looking the other way. But everything I've told you so far, the phone, the flushed cheeks, the half-second glance, that was all just the quiet part, the part before the part where everything broke open. I want to tell you about one more thing before we get there, because it's the memory that haunts me the most now, more than any of the others. About 2 months before I found out everything, Ryan and I went to a wedding together, one of his college friends, the same friend group I mentioned earlier, the one that, it turns out, already knew things about Ryan that I didn't. It was a beautiful wedding, out in the Wisconsin countryside, string lights strung between trees, the kind of night that makes you believe in things. At one point during the reception, the DJ played our song, the one Ryan and I had danced to at a friend's engagement party years earlier, the one he'd once told me, half joking, should be our wedding song someday. He pulled me onto the dance floor, he held me close, he whispered in my ear, "I don't know what I'd do without you." I remember feeling like the luckiest woman in that entire room. Brianna was at that wedding too. I have a photo from that night, someone posted it in the wedding's shared album, where Ryan is dancing with me in the foreground, and if you look just past his shoulder, slightly out of focus, you can see Brianna watching us from across the room. Not smiling, just watching. I didn't notice it then. I found that photo again 9 months later, during the period I'm about to tell you about, and when I saw it, I had to sit down on my sister's guest bed and just breathe for a while. Because by that point, based on the email timeline, Ryan and Brianna had already been together for 8 months. That "I don't know what I'd do without you," whispered on a dance floor, under string lights, while my best friend watched from across the room, happened 8 months into their affair. I tell you this now before we get to the discovery itself because I want you to understand something about how deep this went before I ever suspected a thing. This wasn't a man who slipped once and spiraled into guilt. This was a man capable of looking me directly in the eyes, telling me he loved me, while another woman watched him do it from 20 feet away, a woman he'd see privately less than a week later. That's the man I need you to picture as we move into what happened next. Not a man who made a mistake, a man who had gotten remarkably, comfortably good at living two completely different lives. Because 8 months before that phone call in the hallway, before the champagne, before my promotion, I found out everything, all at once, in a way I never could have prepared for. And I need you to stick with me because what I discovered wasn't just an affair. It was so much bigger than that. It happened on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were never significant before that. Now I can't hear the word without my stomach dropping a little. Ryan had gone out for drinks with coworkers. I was home, working on a pitch deck for a client presentation the next morning, half paying attention to a show in the background. His laptop was open on the coffee table. He'd left it charging before he left, which he never did. Ryan was meticulous about his laptop. It went everywhere with him, even to the bathroom sometimes, which I'd always found strange and had never once questioned out loud. I wasn't snooping. I want to be honest with you about that, because I know how this sounds. I needed to print something for the pitch, and our printer was connected through his laptop, not mine because mine had stopped working with it months earlier, and neither of us had bothered to fix it. I opened his laptop. It wasn't locked, he must have forgotten in his rush to leave. And there, right on the screen, still open from earlier that day, was an email thread. The subject line was, this weekend? I want you to imagine the specific kind of silence that happens in a room the second before your entire life changes. That's the silence I remember, not the show playing in the background, not the hum of the refrigerator, just this total ringing stillness while my eyes moved down the screen. The email was from Brianna's personal account, not her work email, her real one, the one she used for everything, from ordering takeout to emailing her mom. And the thread went back, not weeks, not months, 14 months. I sat down on the floor, right there in front of the coffee table, and I read every single email in that thread. I'm not going to describe the specific contents to you, because some of it isn't something I need to relive out loud. And honestly, some of it isn't something you need in your head either. But I'll tell you the shape of it. It was planning, meticulous, detailed planning. Weekends I thought Ryan was on work trips. He was with her. A guy's fishing trip the previous summer that I now know never had a single other guy on it. A hotel in Milwaukee I remembered him mentioning once, in passing, as somewhere he'd stayed for a conference. There was no conference. There was Brianna. And then I found the email from 3 weeks ago, the one that broke something in me that I don't think has ever fully gone back together the same way. It was Brianna writing to Ryan about me, about how she felt guilty sometimes, but that she deserved happiness too, and that I'm so wrapped up in my career lately anyway, and that eventually Elena will figure it out and it'll almost be a relief for everyone. A relief for everyone. I sat on that floor for almost 2 hours. I didn't cry, not at first. I think I was in some kind of shock, the kind where your brain just quietly starts filing away evidence, connecting dots you'd spent years refusing to connect. The flushed cheeks at my birthday dinner, the bathroom trip that lasted 15 minutes, the joke about calling dibs, the face-down phone, the changing passcodes, the fishing trip, the conference in Milwaukee. 14 months of my life, and I had missed almost all of it because I loved 2 people who had decided together that my trust was something to exploit rather than something to protect. Ryan came home around midnight. He was a little drunk, laughing about something with his phone still in his hand, and he stopped in the doorway when he saw me sitting on the couch with his laptop open on the table in front of me. I watched every ounce of color drain from his face in real time. I want to tell you what he said because I think it's important for you to hear it, especially if you've ever been through something like this yourself. He didn't apologize first. He didn't even deny it first. The very first thing out of his mouth was, "How much did you read?" Not, "I'm so sorry." Not, "Let me explain." His first instinct in the worst moment of both our lives was to assess the damage to himself. That's when I finally cried. Not because of the affair itself, not in that exact moment, but because of that single sentence. Because it told me with total clarity exactly who I had been building a life with for 4 years. He tried everything after that. He told me it wasn't what it looked like, even though I had just read 14 months of emails that made it extremely clear what it looked like. He told me Brianna had pursued him and that he'd been weak. He told me he loved me, that this had nothing to do with how he felt about me, that it was just physical, until I read him the line about how I'd be a relief for everyone and watched him realize there was no explaining that one away. And then, and this is the part I still can't fully wrap my head around even now, he got angry at me. He said I'd been distant. He said my promotion track had made me obsessed with work. He said he'd been lonely. He actually used the sentence, "You have to take some responsibility for this too, Elena," as if 14 months of secret meetups with my best friend were something I had somehow caused by attending client meetings. There was one more exchange from that night I need to tell you about because it's the one that finally made me stop trying to reason with him. At some point, around 1 in the morning, Ryan sat down across from me on the floor. Not next to me, across, like there was already an invisible line between us that neither of us needed to draw. He asked me very quietly, "Do you think you could ever forgive me eventually? Not now, just eventually?" I remember looking at him and asking the only question I actually cared about in that moment. "Ryan, if I hadn't opened that laptop tonight, were you ever going to tell me? Be honest, was there ever a version of this where you told me the truth?" He didn't answer for a long time, and then he said, "I don't know." That was it. Not yes, eventually, not even a comforting lie, just a shrug dressed up as an answer, which told me everything I needed to know about what our entire future would have looked like if I hadn't happened to need that printer that particular Tuesday night. I would have spent who knows how many more months, maybe years, building a life on top of a lie that he had no actual intention of ever correcting on his own. I want to pause here and talk to you directly for a second because I think this next part is something a lot of people in this comment section are going to recognize. The manipulation doesn't stop the moment you find out. In some ways, it gets worse because now the cheater has to justify not just the affair, but the years of lying it took to hide it. And the easiest way to do that is to make you feel like you share the blame. It's called DARVO. Deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. Ryan didn't invent it. Cheaters have been doing this for as long as people have been cheating. But watching it happen to me in real time, in my own living room, at midnight, while I was still holding the laptop that had just destroyed my entire understanding of my life, that's something I will never forget. I need you to sit with me for a second here. 14 months, my best friend, my boyfriend of 4 years, in our home, planning trips around my work schedule, emailing about how my career was making it easier for them. Okay, let's keep going, because it gets worse before it gets better. I moved out 3 days later. I stayed with my sister in her cramped guest room with a mattress get dipped in the middle, and I cried more in those first 2 weeks than I think I'd cried in my entire adult life combined. I blocked Ryan on everything. I blocked Brianna on everything. My phone became a strange, quiet object, No texts from the person who used to text me good morning every day. No calls from the friend I used to talk to for hours. The silence was its own kind of grief. But something else happened during those 2 weeks, something I didn't expect and honestly didn't fully understand at the time. My sister sat me down on day 4, made me a cup of tea I didn't drink, and said something I've thought about almost every day since. She said, "Elena, you can fall apart. You're allowed. But I need you to promise me one thing. Don't give him the satisfaction of watching you fall apart where he can see it. Let him wonder." I didn't know it yet, but that one sentence was the seed of everything that came after. Because over the next few weeks, as the shock started to fade into something colder and clearer, I started noticing something. Ryan kept trying to reach me, not to apologize, or not only to apologize, he kept trying to control the narrative. Mutual friends started mentioning that Ryan had been telling people we'd grown apart, that I'd changed, that things had been complicated for a while. He was quietly rewriting 14 months of betrayal into a story where he was simply a man who'd made one mistake in a relationship that was already struggling, a story where I had some hand in causing it. And Brianna had gone completely silent. No apology, no explanation, just silence. And I later found out, a very active new Instagram presence featuring her and Ryan looking extremely happy together within about 6 weeks of me moving out. There's one more thing that happened during those first 2 weeks that I haven't told you yet. And it's important, because it's the moment my sister's advice actually got tested for the first time. About 10 days after I moved out, Brianna showed up at my sister's apartment building. Not called first, not texted, just showed up, buzzed the intercom, and stood in the lobby when my sister reluctantly let her up because Brianna was crying so hard through the intercom speaker that my sister thought something might genuinely be wrong. I almost didn't go down, but some part of me needed to see her face when she said whatever she'd driven 40 minutes to say. She told me she was sorry. She told me she never meant for it to happen, that it had just happened, the way people always say, as if affairs are natural disasters instead of decisions made over and over again for 14 months every single time either of them picked up the phone to text the other. She told me she still loved me as a friend and that she hoped someday I could understand. I remember looking at her, this woman who had held my hand in the hospital waiting room when my grandmother was dying, who had been my maid of honor plan before I even had a wedding, who knew the code to my childhood garage door, and I asked her one question. Did you ever, once, think about what this would do to me? She didn't answer right away, and in that silence, I got my answer anyway. She said, quietly, I thought about it. I just wanted him more. Not, I made a terrible mistake, not, I got caught up in something I regret, a calculated preference spoken out loud, like she was choosing between 2 entrees on a menu. That sentence did something to me that the emails hadn't quite managed. The emails were evidence of an act. That sentence was a confession of intent. Then came the harder part, telling my family. I called my mom first. I remember sitting on my sister's bathroom floor, the door locked, my knees pulled up to my chest, trying to find words for something that still didn't feel real even as I said it out loud. My mom went quiet for almost 30 seconds after I told her, which, if you know my mother, is basically an eternity, and then she said something I didn't expect. She said, Elena, I need you to hear me say this clearly. This is not something you caused. This is not a referendum on your worth, your career, or anything you did or didn't do in that relationship. This is about who Ryan chose to be when he thought no one was watching. My dad, the man who never once complimented a man I dated, except Ryan, didn't say much on the phone. But 3 days later, an enormous bouquet of flowers showed up at my sister's apartment with a card that just said, Proud of you for leaving. Love, Dad. I still have that card. It's in a drawer in my new apartment.
the one that belongs only to me. That's when something shifted in me. I stopped being just devastated, and I started being something else too, something quieter, more focused. I want to be really clear with you here, because this is a revenge story, and I know that word carries a lot of weight. I never once considered doing anything illegal, anything violent, anything that would hurt anyone physically or destroy anyone's property or livelihood in a way I couldn't stand behind. That was never who I wanted to become. But I also wasn't willing to let Ryan quietly rewrite the story of what happened to me. I wasn't willing to let him walk away clean, with a new relationship and a new narrative, while I got left holding the wreckage of a version of events that made me the reason my own trust got broken. So I made a decision, a quiet one I didn't tell anyone about at first, not even my sister. I decided I wasn't going to react, not yet. I was going to watch, I was going to wait, and I was going to build something Ryan and Brianna would never see coming, not out of hatred, but out of something much more dangerous to people like them: patience. But what happened next, I never saw coming either, because within a few weeks, I started getting messages from people I hadn't heard from in a long time, people connected to Ryan's world, and what they told me changed the entire shape of what I was planning to do. Here's something I've learned about small, close-knit social circles. Nothing stays buried forever. Somebody always knows something, and eventually that somebody tells you. About a month after I moved out, I got a message from a woman named Jess. Jess wasn't a close friend of mine, she was more of a friend, someone I saw at group hangouts a few times a year, married to one of Ryan's college roommates. We weren't close enough that she owed me anything, and that's exactly why what she told me mattered so much. Jess messaged me out of the blue, and she said something I'll never forget. She said, "I don't know if this is my place, but I heard what happened, and I think you deserve to know something before Ryan tells everyone his version first." What she told me cracked the entire story wide open. It turned out Brianna wasn't the first, not even close. According to Jess, who had heard it directly from her husband, who had known Ryan since freshman year of college, Ryan had a pattern, a long one. There had been a woman 2 years before Brianna, someone from his gym, that Ryan's college friends all knew about and had simply never told me because it wasn't their business, and because Ryan had begged them to stay quiet, framing it as a one-time thing that meant nothing, that he'd never do again. They believed him, and they said nothing. For 2 years, people who called themselves my friends by proxy knew that Ryan had cheated once already and let me walk deeper and deeper into a relationship with him without a single word of warning. I sat with that information for a long time. It reframed everything. It meant Brianna wasn't a unique betrayal, a one-off crack in an otherwise solid foundation. It meant I had been in a relationship for years with a man who had a documented pattern of infidelity, protected by a quiet circle of people who valued his comfort over my right to know the truth. It also meant something else, something that mattered a lot for what came next. It meant Ryan's story, the one he'd been telling people about growing apart, about things being complicated, wasn't just a spin on our breakup. It was a strategy he had used before, a rehearsed one, which told me that whatever came next with Brianna, whatever happened between them, Ryan would eventually need a new narrative again. Cheaters like Ryan don't stop the pattern, they just find new people to run it on. So I made my first real decision in the plan, and it was this. I wasn't going to try to punish Ryan directly. I wasn't going to send angry texts, show up at his apartment, or try to sabotage his job. None of that. Instead, I decided I was simply going to make sure the truth existed somewhere permanent, somewhere undeniable, and that when the moment eventually came for it to matter, I would be ready. I started keeping records, not obsessively, not in a way that consumed my life, but carefully.
I saved the original emails I'd read that night, forwarding copies to my personal account before I moved out, something I'd done almost instinctively in the fog of that first terrible evening, without even fully realizing why. I kept screenshots of the version of events Ryan was telling mutual friends, sent to me by people like Jess, who thought I deserved to know. I wrote down dates, timelines, small, boring, methodical documentation, the kind that feels unsatisfying in the moment, but becomes incredibly powerful later. I also started seeing a therapist. Her name was Dr. Alvarez, and I want to mention her specifically because she said something in our third session that reframed the entire way I thought about what I was doing. I told her about the documentation, the saved emails, the timeline, the screenshots. I remember feeling almost guilty admitting it out loud, like I expected her to tell me I was obsessing, that I needed to let go and move forward the way every well-meaning platitude on the internet tells you to after a breakup. Instead, she asked me a question. Elena, when you imagine using this information someday, what does that actually look like to you? Are you imagining hurting him, or are you imagining simply not having to carry the lie anymore? I sat with that question for a long time, and the answer, when it finally came to me, surprised even myself. I didn't actually want to destroy Ryan's life. I didn't fantasize about him losing his job or his friends, or ending up alone and miserable, the way revenge fantasies usually go. What I'd wanted since that first terrible night on my living room floor, was simply for the truth to exist somewhere outside of my own memory. I wanted proof that I hadn't imagined my own reality. I wanted someday for someone other than me to say out loud, yes, that actually happened, and it wasn't your fault. Dr. Alvarez told me that wanting that wasn't unhealthy. It wasn't revenge in the toxic sense. It was something much more basic. It was the desire to be believed. And she told me something else that I've held on to ever since. The healthiest people I know aren't the ones who forgive and forget the fastest. They're the ones who face the full truth of what happened to them without flinching, and then decide clearly and calmly what they're going to do about it. That session changed something for me. It gave me permission to keep building what I was building without the guilt I'd been quietly carrying that maybe I was becoming someone bitter, someone consumed. I wasn't consumed. I was, for the first time in a long time, clear. I also did something else, something that had nothing to do with Ryan at all and everything to do with me. I threw myself into my work. Not in an unhealthy, avoidant way, though I'm sure some of it was that in the beginning, but my director, Patricia, had noticed something shift in me after I came back from those first 2 devastating weeks. I stopped leaving early. I started pitching bigger ideas in meetings. I volunteered for a rebrand project nobody else wanted because the client was famously difficult, and I nailed it. Over the following months, I built a reputation at that agency as someone who could be handed the hard accounts and deliver. I wasn't doing it to prove anything to Ryan. I want to be clear about that. I was doing it because, for the first time in years, my career felt like the one part of my life that hadn't been a lie. Every win there was mine. Nobody else's name was on it. Nobody had been secretly planning around it behind my back. There was a coworker of mine, Marcus, who I need to mention here because he became an important part of this chapter of my life, even though this isn't a story about a new romance rescuing me. It isn't, and I want to be careful about that because I know how these stories sometimes go. Marcus was a senior strategist on my team, easygoing, sharp, the kind of person who noticed when someone was having a hard week without ever making a big deal about asking about it. He never once tried to make a move during those raw early months, and I respected him more for that than almost anything else. What Marcus did do was treat me, consistently, like someone whose ideas were worth taking seriously. In meetings where I might have once deferred to louder voices, he'd turn to me and ask, "What does Elena think?" Not out of pity, because he actually wanted to know. It sounds small, but after 4 years of slowly shrinking myself around someone who needed to be the most impressive person in the room, being around someone who simply made space for me without expecting anything in return recalibrated something in me that I didn't even realize had gone quiet. By the time the rebrand project landed on my desk, the one I mentioned, for the notoriously difficult client, Marcus was the one who told Patricia I should lead it, not him, me. When I hesitated, worried I wasn't ready, he said something I've repeated to myself many times since. You've been ready for a while, you just haven't had anyone in your corner telling you that consistently enough for you to believe it. I got that campaign. I delivered it. It became the foundation of everything that came after, including the promotion that would eventually set this entire final chapter into motion. Around the 6-month mark, my allies started to reveal themselves in ways I hadn't expected. My sister, obviously, she'd been in my corner from day one, but Jess became an unexpected ally too. She started quietly keeping me updated on what was happening in Ryan and Brianna's world, not because she wanted drama, she told me, but because she felt guilty about the silence around the gym woman 2 years earlier, and this was her way of making it right. Through Jess, I learned that Ryan and Brianna's relationship, which launched into public view with so much confidence right after I moved out, was already showing cracks. Brianna's family, who I had known for years, who had genuinely loved me, who had welcomed Ryan at first only because I'd vouched for him, were reportedly uneasy about the whole situation. Brianna's mother, in particular, had never fully forgiven the way things had happened, and had said as much at a family dinner that made its way back to me through the world's most reliable gossip network, mutual friends who couldn't keep a secret.
That detail mattered more than I realized at the time. Brianna's family still respected me. They didn't know the full story, the pattern, the 2-year-old affair with the gym woman, the calculated planning in those emails. They only knew the broad strokes, that Ryan had cheated on me with Brianna, and that Brianna had chosen a boyfriend over a decade of friendship. I filed that detail away too, quietly, patiently. Around month 7, something happened that almost derailed everything. Ryan reached out, for the first time since I'd blocked him, through a mutual friend, asking if we could talk, just once, for closure. I said no, firmly. My sister nearly threw a party when I told her. But 2 days later, I got an email, not from Ryan, from Brianna. It was long, rambling, half apology, half self-justification, the way those messages always are. She said she'd been struggling with guilt. She said Ryan had told her our relationship was basically over before anything happened between them, a lie I could disprove with 14 months of emails sitting quietly in my archive. She said she hoped we could eventually be friends again, once enough time had passed. I didn't respond, but I saved that email too, because it was, without her realizing it, a written confession, time-stamped in her own words of exactly what she knew and when she knew it. It contradicted the story Ryan had been telling people about things being complicated and already over before Brianna entered the picture. It was, in its own clumsy way, the final piece I needed. By month 9, I had everything. A full picture. 14 months of emails proving a deliberate, sustained affair. A second, earlier affair from 2 years before Brianna, corroborated by multiple sources close to Ryan. A written admission from Brianna that directly contradicted the "we were basically already broken up" narrative Ryan had been feeding to mutual friends, and, I later learned, to his own family. Timeline documentation, screenshots, everything organized, dated, and saved in 3 separate places, because if there's one thing my career had taught me by then, it's that you always back up your work. I want to be honest with you about something. I never planned to send any of it to anyone unprompted. That was important to me. I didn't want to become someone who tears through other people's lives just to satisfy my own anger. That's not who I wanted to be on the other side of this. My plan was simpler, and honestly a little scarier because of how patient it was. I was going to wait. I was going to let Ryan's own choices catch up to him, and when the moment came, when he inevitably tried to rewrite the story again,
the way he'd done with the gym woman 2 years earlier, the way he was already trying to do with me, I would have the truth ready, not to destroy him for sport, just to make sure that for once in his life, the story that survived was the real one. What I didn't know yet, what I couldn't have known, was exactly how that moment would arrive. I assumed it would be small, a conversation with a mutual friend, a moment where someone repeated one of Ryan's lies to my face and I quietly corrected the record. I never imagined it would arrive the exact same day I got promoted to VP of Marketing, in a phone call in a hallway with Ryan crying on the other end of the line, begging me to take him back. But that's exactly what happened, and once I understood why he was really calling, not because he loved me, not because he'd had some grand realization, but because of something happening in his life that had absolutely nothing to do with me at all, everything I'd spent 9 months quietly building finally had somewhere to go. Let's go back to that hallway, champagne in one hand, phone in the other, and Ryan's voice cracking on the other end of the line telling me he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. I asked him one simple question. I kept my voice completely calm, the way you'd ask someone what time their flight lands. Ryan, what happened with Brianna? There was this long silence, and then he told me in this rehearsed, half-tearful voice that things had fallen apart, that he'd realized Brianna wasn't you, that he'd made a terrible error in judgment, and that not a day went by where he didn't think about what he'd thrown away with me. It sounded, on the surface, like remorse. Real remorse, even. If I hadn't spent 9 months quietly gathering the truth, I might have believed it. But I already knew something Ryan had no idea I knew, because 2 days earlier, Jess had messaged me with the real story. Brianna's father, the one whose good opinion I mentioned mattered, worked in finance in the same city, and it turned out he had connections at Ryan's firm. Real ones. Enough that Ryan's engagement to Brianna, which had happened just 3 months earlier in a lavish, heavily documented proposal at a rooftop restaurant, had been at least partially about access. Access to Brianna's father's network. Access to clients Ryan had been struggling to land on his own merit. And Brianna had just found out, through her own mother who never fully trusted Ryan, that Ryan had been quietly messaging someone else. Not me. A new woman, someone from his office. The pattern, again, exactly like the gym woman 2 years before me, exactly like me before that. Brianna broke off the engagement, publicly, at a family dinner in front of her parents. Ryan had lost the relationship, lost the access to Brianna's father's connections, and, Jess told me, was already facing quiet questions at his firm about a client relationship that had soured right around the time Brianna's father stopped taking his calls. So when he saw my LinkedIn post announcing my promotion to VP of Marketing at a well-known, growing agency, with my name suddenly appearing in industry articles, Ryan wasn't calling because he missed me. He was calling because I represented, once again, exactly what he was always looking for. Someone successful. Someone whose success he could attach himself to. Someone he could use as both a soft landing and a status symbol, the same way he'd used Brianna's family connections, the same way, I now understood, he'd probably used me, quietly, for 4 years, without me ever fully realizing it. I stood there in that hallway and felt something settle in me. Not rage, exactly. Something colder than rage. Something almost like relief, because for the first time I understood him completely. Every question I'd been asking myself for 9 months, why me, why then, why did any of this happen, resolved into a single, simple answer. Ryan didn't love people, he orbited them. He attached himself to whoever offered the most, and when that ran out, he moved to whoever offered more. "Elena, please," he said when I didn't respond right away. Just meet me for coffee, one conversation, that's all I'm asking. And here's where the plan I'd spent 9 months building finally came into play. I said yes. I know how that sounds. I know some of you watching this are yelling at your screen right now, but hear me out, because this was never about giving Ryan a real second chance. This was about giving Ryan exactly enough rope. Before I tell you about that meeting, I need to tell you what happened in the 3 days between his phone call and the coffee shop, because those 3 days were, in a lot of ways, the most important of this entire story. The first thing I did was call my sister. She picked up on the first ring like she somehow knew. When I told her Ryan had called, the exact same day as my promotion, she went completely silent for a second, and then she said, "Okay, tell me everything, and then tell me what you're going to do, because I already know you have a plan. You've had a plan for months." She was right. I did. The second thing I did was call Jess. This was the first time I'd ever spoken to her on the phone instead of just messaging. Up until that point, our entire relationship had existed through screenshots and quiet updates. I told her what Ryan had said. I told her about the engagement breaking off, the trouble at his firm, the timing of it all, and I asked her, point blank, if she'd be willing to help me one more time. She didn't hesitate. She said, "Elena, I've felt guilty for 2 years about not telling you what I knew about that woman from the gym. Whatever you need, I'm in." The third thing I did was the hardest. I called Dr. Alvarez and asked for an emergency session because I needed to be honest with myself about my own motives before I did anything else. I sat in her office and told her everything. The phone call, the champagne still sitting untouched in my office fridge, the strange, cold clarity I'd felt standing in that hallway. She asked me the same question she'd asked months earlier. What does this actually look like to you? What do you want to happen? And this time I had an answer immediately. I told her I didn't want Ryan back, not even a little. What I wanted was for the truth, the real, complete truth, the one I'd been quietly assembling for 9 months, to finally exist somewhere it couldn't be talked over, rewritten, or explained away. I wanted one time to hear Ryan say something true out loud, in his own voice, without an audience he needed to perform for. Dr. Alvarez nodded slowly and said, "Then that's what this is. Not a reunion, an interview." That word stuck with me. An interview. Not a reconciliation. Not a trap exactly either. I wasn't planning to lie to him, manipulate him into saying things that weren't true, or twist his words. I was simply going to give him the exact same amount of rope he'd have offered anyone else in any other context where he thought there was something to gain, and see what he did with it. I already had a strong suspicion about what that would be. Ryan had never, in 4 years, been able to resist explaining himself when he thought an audience was sympathetic. He needed to be understood as the good guy, even in moments where being honest could only hurt him. That instinct, that specific narcissistic need to narrate his own redemption, was the one thing about him I could actually predict with total confidence. We met 3 days later, at a coffee shop near my new office, a detail I chose deliberately, because I knew Ryan would try to make the meeting about how impressive my new position was, try to angle for information about my trajectory, my salary, my future. I let him. I asked my friend Jess, who by this point had become genuinely invested in seeing this through with me, to sit 2 tables away with her laptop open, like any other stranger working in a coffee shop. She wasn't there to record anything secretly and sinister. She was simply there as a witness. And because Illinois requires 2-party consent for private conversations, I made sure Ryan knew from the start that I might want to record parts of our conversation for my own clarity, which he agreed to, eager, in that moment, to prove how transparent and remorseful he'd become. That agreement mattered. because it meant everything that came next was completely above board, nothing secret, nothing sneaky, nothing that could ever be called out as manipulative or illegal, just Ryan talking, with full knowledge that his words were being recorded, because he was so desperate to convince me of his sincerity that he never once considered what he might actually reveal. Over the next 40 minutes, Ryan told me everything I already knew, just from his own mouth, in his own words, on the record. He told me, almost proudly, framing it as evidence of his growth, that he'd realized during the relationship with Brianna that he'd made the wrong choice, that I was the one who really understood him. He told me about some tension at his firm that he brushed off as office politics, not realizing I already knew through Jess that it was connected to Brianna's father pulling his support. At one point, he reached across the table and tried to take my hand. I let him, just for a second, mostly because I wanted to see what he'd do next, and also, I'll admit, because some small, tired part of me needed to know I could touch that hand again and feel absolutely nothing where 4 years of love used to be. I felt nothing. It was, in its own strange way, one of the most freeing moments of the entire 9 months. He talked about the future in that soft, rehearsed voice he'd always been good at, how we could start slow, how he'd do the work this time, how he understood if I needed him to prove himself for as long as it took. It was, almost word for word, the same speech pattern Jess's husband had described him using with the gym woman situation 2 years earlier, when Ryan had convinced his own friend group to give him one more chance to prove himself worthy of trust. He wasn't improvising, he had a script. He'd just used it enough times to make it sound spontaneous. And then, near the end, he said something that became the single most important sentence of this entire story. He said, "Brianna was never you, Elena. I think some part of me always knew I'd end up back here eventually. I just needed the timing to be right. The timing to be right. Not, I love you, not, I've changed, just an admission, casual and self-satisfied, that this had never been about remorse at all. It had been about waiting for a moment when coming back to me would actually benefit him. And my promotion, my success, the thing I had built entirely on my own." During the exact months he'd spent recovering from losing Brianna, had finally made that moment arrive. I want to walk you through exactly what I did with everything I had, because this is the part where 9 months of patience finally paid off, and where I promise you, if you've stuck with me this far, you're going to feel it. I didn't yell at him in that coffee shop. I didn't throw my drink at him, satisfying as that might have felt in the moment. I simply thanked him for meeting me, told him I needed time to think, and left. Here's what happened over the following 2 weeks. First, I reached out to Brianna directly, something I hadn't done in 9 months. Not to hurt her further, she'd already broken off the engagement and was, by every account, going through her own painful reckoning with who Ryan actually was. Instead, I sent her one message and one attachment. The email she'd sent me 9 months earlier, the one where she'd claimed Ryan told her our relationship was basically over before anything started between them, next to the timeline of the 14 months of emails I'd found, proving that claim had never been true. I didn't add commentary. I didn't need to. I simply wrote, "I think you deserve the full picture too," the same way I eventually got mine. Brianna wrote back within an hour. She thanked me. She told me she'd already suspected as much but hadn't let herself fully believe it. It wasn't friendship, and it never would be again. Some things don't come back from what happened. But it was closure, for both of us, built on truth instead of the half-stories we'd each been fed. Second, I sent the recording, the full 40-minute conversation where Ryan admitted in his own voice that he'd been waiting for the timing to be right and that Brianna had never been me, to Jess's husband and 2 of Ryan's other close college friends. Not to strangers, Not posted publicly online, not sent to his employer, nothing that crossed into territory that could hurt his livelihood or his safety. Just to the small circle of people who had spent years quietly protecting Ryan's reputation, covering for the gym woman 2 years before me, staying silent while I walked deeper into a relationship with a man they knew had a pattern. I wanted them to hear it in his own words, not my version, not a summary, his actual voice admitting exactly what kind of person he was. The fallout was almost immediate. Within a week, Jess told me Ryan's college friend group, the same men who had known about the gym woman and said nothing, had essentially frozen him out. Not out of some grand moral awakening necessarily, but because Ryan's careless honesty in that recording had implicated all of them too, in a way. It made the years of quiet covering up impossible to ignore anymore. Once one secret cracked open, the whole pattern became visible, and nobody wanted to be associated with it anymore. Third, and this is the part I hesitated about the most because it involved someone who'd already been hurt enough. I let Brianna's mother know, gently, through a mutual acquaintance rather than directly, that the basically already over story Ryan had been telling everyone, including her daughter, didn't hold up against the timeline. I didn't do this out of spite toward Brianna. I did it because Brianna's mother had never trusted Ryan, had said as much at that family dinner, and deserved to know her instincts had been right all along. Not for my sake, but for her daughter's, so that whatever came next for Brianna, it could at least start from solid ground instead of another one of Ryan's rewritten stories. I heard, weeks later, that this was the detail that finally completely ended any lingering hope of reconciliation between Ryan and Brianna's family. Not the affair itself, people can sometimes forgive an affair, given enough time. It was the lie stacked on top of it, the realization that Ryan hadn't just betrayed me once, he'd been actively managing a false narrative for months, to everyone, including the family he'd been trying to marry into. Then came the twist I genuinely did not see coming, even after everything. About 3 weeks after all of this, I got a message from Patricia, my director, the woman who had championed my promotion. Turns out my agency had just landed a major new client account, a financial services firm, expanding their marketing budget significantly, looking for an agency partner for a full rebrand. The firm was Ryan's firm. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I genuinely did not orchestrate this. I had no idea it was coming. Patricia had been in talks with this client for months, long before any of this reached its conclusion, completely unconnected to my personal life. When she told me the account had been assigned to my team, with me as the lead point of contact given my new VP role, I actually laughed out loud in my office, alone, for probably a full minute. Because it meant that Ryan, the man who had built his entire adult identity around being the confident, successful one in every room, was now going to have to sit across a conference table from me in a professional setting as my client's representative, reporting up to me on a campaign my team controlled. I handled it exactly the way I've handled everything else in this story, professionally, calmly, and completely on the record. I didn't request him removed from the account out of some desire to avoid him. Honestly, avoiding him would have been the easier path. Instead, I did my job, thoroughly and excellently the way I always had, and let Ryan sit through months of client meetings watching the woman he'd once dismissed as distant and obsessed with work run circles around every strategic decision his firm needed. He never brought up our history in those meetings. Not once. I never did either. We were simply two professionals in a room, except one of us had built something real, and the other was, by that point, quietly being pushed out of client-facing meetings by his own firm's leadership after word of some personal drama affecting his judgment had made its way, inevitably, through the industry's small, gossipy network. I heard, months later, through channels I no longer even needed to actively maintain, that Ryan had left that firm entirely, that the engagement with Brianna's family connections had cost him professionally more than he'd ever anticipated, that the college friend group who used to protect him had largely stopped returning his calls, that whatever version of the story he tried to tell after all this, there were simply too many people now who knew the real one. I didn't do any of that to him directly. I never sent a single cruel word. I never lied. I never manipulated a situation that wasn't already true. All I did was refuse, finally, to let his version of events be the only one that survived. And me? My team delivered that rebrand campaign 11% above the client's projected engagement targets. Patricia put me up for another promotion 6 months later. I bought my own apartment, the first thing in my adult life that belonged entirely, completely, only to me. I want to tell you one last thing before I wrap this up, because I think it matters more than the professional twist, more than the recording, more than any single piece of the plan I spent 9 months building. About a year after all of this settled, I ran into Brianna's mother at a farmer's market, completely by accident. I hadn't seen her since before everything fell apart. I braced myself for an awkward, painful interaction. Instead, she hugged me, hard, unexpectedly, and told me she was proud of how I'd handled everything. Not the recording, not the professional fallout, none of the specifics she probably didn't even know in full. Just the fact that, in her words, you never once let it turn you into someone unkind. That takes more strength than anything else. I think about that a lot, because it would have been so easy at almost any point in those 9 months to become someone unkind, to lash out, to burn everything down the moment I found those emails, consequences be damned. Nobody would have blamed me, honestly, not after 14 months of lies stacked on top of a pattern that went even further than that. But I don't think that version of the story would have felt like justice. I think it would have just felt like more chaos, more mess, one more thing Ryan could point to later as evidence that I was the unstable one, the dramatic one, the reason things fell apart. Patience wasn't just strategy, it was armor. It meant that when the truth finally did come out, nobody could say I lied, exaggerated, or manipulated anything to get there. Every single piece of it was simply what actually happened, laid out in order in the words of the people who lived it. Looking back on all of it now, here's what I actually learned, and I think it's more important than any of the satisfying parts of this story. The betrayal wasn't really the worst part. The worst part was the 9 months afterward, when I had to relearn how to trust my own read on people, how to notice red flags without spiraling, how to give people the benefit of the doubt without handing them a blindfold to put over my eyes. I also learned that revenge, the kind that actually feels good afterward, the kind that doesn't leave you feeling hollow, that's not about destroying someone. It's about refusing to disappear. Ryan spent 9 months hoping I would quietly fade into a footnote in his story, a woman who just didn't work out. All I ever did was make sure the truth got to exist in the same room as his version of events. That was never petty. That was never illegal. That was just me, finally refusing to stay silent for someone else's comfort. If there's one thing I want you to take from this, it's this. The people who betray you almost always underestimate how much you're paying attention. They assume your silence means forgetting. It doesn't. Sometimes it just means you're building something quietly, patiently, and completely on your own terms. And when the moment finally comes, you won't need to raise your voice at all. I'd genuinely love to know, what would you have done in my position? Would you have taken that coffee meeting? Would you have sent Brianna that email? Drop a comment and let me know, because I read every single one, and I know a lot of you watching this have your own version of this story. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you for sitting through this one with me. It wasn't an easy story to tell, but it felt important to tell it fully, the way it actually happened. If you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe, because there are a lot more where this came from, and trust me, some of them get even wilder than this. Take care of yourselves out there. And remember, the truth always finds its way to the surface eventually. You just have to be patient enough to let it.